Hello, everyone, and welcome to our third webinar for this campaign. I hope you are watching us, and we are sorry for the postponing of this webinar, but that makes it even more exciting than it was before. So hello, I think everybody knows me already. My name is Anna, and I work for Climate Tracker. And here we have with us today Jesse Bragg from Corporate Accountability International. He has done some webinars with us in the past. Hello, Jesse, how are you?
Doing great. Really excited to be here. And thanks everyone for making the time to get on.
Thanks for joining us. So I think everybody knows already, but I will just introduce briefly Jesse. He is the media person for the media director for Corporate Accountability International. We meet always with him in co-ops, and he organizes this amazing press events when they explain how bad is the fossil fuel industry doing generally. But he before has worked in different campaigns in different states of the US. So that gives him, I think, a very interesting background for us to be here with us. So I will just start this webinar by reminding you how is the campaign going. So you still have some days to publish, not a lot, but I think you can push the last moments and start publishing. You can always reach out if you have any problems, or if an editor is not replying to you, or if you need like fresh idea that you didn't think of. We are always here to help with that. And you will find all the information and ideas and everything, both in our website, which is brand new, so you have to check it, and also on our social media. You can always tweet at us or talk to us on Facebook, all these things. And for today, you can send us questions for sure. I think Jesse will be very happy to answer them. So you can hashtag Climate Tracker, use the hashtag to send us questions, or tag us, which is @ClimateTracking. We are now using YouTube, which is our new way of doing webinars, and YouTube also has this nice timeline next to the screen, which is like a chat, and you can send questions there. I will be checking too. So that's a lot of information, but you can always reach us this way. And I will just start with this webinar, which will be on liability on the fossil fuel and the tobacco industry, our third topic, and I think you know it very well. So we'll start with the first question, and I guess the easy one for Jesse, which is, the tobacco industry knew about its health impacts, and the fossil fuel industry knew about climate change. So how was this discovered, and what did they exactly know beforehand?
Yeah, it's interesting. There are so many parallels when you really start looking at what each of these industries knew and what they covered up. So on the tobacco front, by the 1960s, there was mounting evidence about the health impacts of tobacco and the addictiveness of nicotine. But we couldn't fathom the true extent to which the industry knew about and concluded on burying the facts of those facts until about the 1990s, when the Master Settlement Agreement, which was what exactly it sounds like, a settlement between the US government and the major tobacco companies, forced the release of millions of pages of internal industry documents. It was frankly shocking when you really looked at what those documents released or contained. The tobacco industry had conducted its own research to confirm that tobacco caused cancer and was addictive. And not only that, but they had known and recognized much of this before other scientists. For example, in 1953, according to those documents, of clinical data, quote, tend to confirm the relationship between heavy and prolonged tobacco smoking and incidence of cancer of the lung. So when you look at that, and then you look at what we've recently seen around Exxon, where Exxon was spending millions of dollars funding climate research, did things like build their oil rigs a little bit higher to accommodate the rising sea levels, and did all of this in large part before mainstream science had caught up, and also in the public eye was defending their right to extract and burn fossil fuels, and really polluting the narrative and the debate around climate science and what we needed to do in order to avoid the worst effects of climate change. The parallels go very deep. And it's what we call at our organization the tobacco playbook.
Wow. So there's a playbook and they are really copying it. And that's really interesting. So we want to know a bit more about this playbook. Mm-hmm. To me, it sounds like How I Met Your Mother or something. But I guess it's something more serious. And these techniques are something that we may see now if we look at the fossil fuel industry, for example. So can you share some of the techniques that they use?
Yeah, absolutely. And I encourage everyone to look into a film called Merchants of Doubt. It was made by the same director who made Food Incorporated, and it takes a really deep look at a lot of these plays based on the tobacco industry documents and how they've affected the climate debate. But to look at the tactics, or the plays as we call them, from this playbook, they include questioning the science. So as an example, in the tobacco industry's own words, according to Brown and Williamson in 1969, quote, "Doubt is our product, since it's the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the mind of the general public. It is also the means of establishing a controversy." So it wasn't to disagree or to prove the science wrong, but just plant a seed of doubt in it that will prolong the debate and allow them to continue to sell their products. Another tactic was shoot the messenger, whether it's scientists or advocates. And we're not talking actually that weren't actually advocating violence. What it means is to attack anyone who dares to publicize or even research its products. The tobacco industry attempted to target the funding of top scientists and hired people to harass them. And now the fossil fuel industry has done the same. For example, many of you may be familiar with the name Mark Morano. He's an industry PR stalwart. He's infamous in the US, runs a website called Climate Depot, where he just looks at climate scientists and will expose them, putting their personal phone numbers online, putting their addresses online, simply to make it more difficult for them to do the science that they need to do. And then he also publishes articles that just attack people's credibility, oftentimes in a very baseless way. Another one of the tactics from the playbook is shifting the blame. And that's all about finding a different scapegoat. If we don't want it to be tobacco, who can we blame for this? So in the 1970s, people were dying from fires caused by cigarettes. Literally falling asleep, for example, with a cigarette in their hand, it would ignite whatever they were sitting on and cause a house fire. So the tobacco industry didn't want to create a self-extinguishing cigarette. That would have changed their product, and also admitted that their product was to blame. So they decided to shift the blame to furniture. And I know it sounds ridiculous to think about it, but it's actually had a huge impact. They hired a doctor to testify before state legislatures. They neutralized a potential threat by infiltrating a group called the National Association of State Fire Marshals in the US, and convinced them to focus on flammable furniture as opposed to cigarettes. So now in the US, just so you know, there's still laws on the books about having flame retardants in furniture. And that's because the tobacco industry shifted the blame from the source of the ignition of these fires, the cigarette, to the fuel, which was the furniture people happened to be sitting on when they were smoking a cigarette. And so now the fossil fuel industry has done the same. They've funded scientists who oppose the overwhelming scientific consensus that greenhouse gases are driving climate change. For example, many of you may be familiar with the Willie Soon scandal, Willie Soon concluded that solar variation, not human activity, was causing global warming. So down the line, you see these parallels between the two industries. Some of the other, and I won't go into too much detail on them, the other tactics include create controversy, find industry-friendly scientists, invoke this idea of freedom. Anything that intends to regulate these industries is violating your freedom, and mobilize third parties so that the industry itself is not on the front lines of this fight, that other groups not directly associated with the industry are fighting this fight for it. So those are a few of the plays that we've seen in both the tobacco industry and the fossil fuel industry, and frankly, the chemical industry, the asbestos industry, and many other abusive industries around the world use a lot of these same plays to stave off regulation.
Well, so first of all, we have to watch Americans of Doubt. I will make sure to share it with everyone. But aside from that, you are saying that kind of solar variation, it's the furniture ignition, right? It's like the way to create attention somewhere else. It's really crazy.
I mean, they also talk about the wobble in the Earth's axis having more to do with climate change than human activity. It's finding anything, literally anything, that they can blame that's not the product they're trying to defend.
Yeah, so it's then blame the sun or the angle of the Earth or something.
Right.
So big tobacco was eventually declared guilty for some of the things, I guess not everything, and they had to pay a fine. How did that happen? Was this enough?
Yeah, I mean, so there's this saying in the U.S. Called "It takes a village" to get something big done, and it literally took a village to get this done with big tobacco. You had organizers and advocates, journalists, governments, whistleblowers, and just the general population in the U.S. all had critical roles in moving this forward. So the first thing that it required was evidence. So this took long hours by scientists who had to persevere through industry harassment. And it took whistleblowers as part of that brought industry documents forward that were not public. It required a shift in the public climate, which took organizing and campaigning to expose and challenge the industry's spin and interference. And I think that's a very, very important piece, especially for this conversation, because that's what we're doing now. What we're doing is talking about the science that's known out there and the facts that are known, and making sure that it's not just the folks on this call and that are within the UNFCCC that live and breathe this stuff. We need the general population around the world to understand the realities. And then related to that is media. People are only going to get upset. They're only going to take action if they know about it. And so the media had a very critical role in ensuring that the real evidence and the real facts got out, not just industry spin. And then governments. Governments are vitally important in not only moving the dial on this, but locking in regulation to protect people and the environment. So governments were then equipped, once the public climate has shifted, once the evidence was overwhelming, governments were able to step in and take powerful legal action. And it's brought us very far, but we still have ways to go. And the liability itself is very powerful, but it doesn't complete the picture. You also have to think about how to mitigate things like conflicts of interest within policymaking space. But liability and the often controversy around certain legal cases is what really helps to move the public climate and compel world leaders to take action. So we're still in terms of tobacco, we're still on that journey now, but we've come a long, long way, and it's sort of blazed the trail for other movements to regulate certain industries, including the fossil fuel industry.
Okay, so I hope that the site of media that we are using as climate tracker does help to highlight the issues on the fossil fuel industry. So do you think there are actual connections with the fossil fuel industry and the tobacco industry, in the meaning of like PR firms, investors, politicians that are playing the same tricks with both cases?
Yes. In short, yes. The ties go very, very deep here. And I'll just take them sort of one by one. We look at scientists. There's lots of overlap between big oil and big tobacco. There are a few well-known names that come up a lot in that film I mentioned, Merchants of Doubt. A guy named Fred Singer, Fred Seitz, Bill Nuremberg were identified as spokespeople for each industry, and had the same concerns, and found different ways of navigating the science in order to disprove it. And actually, just while we're talking about Merchants of Doubt, I think it's just important to mention that the film is actually based on a book by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway of the same name, which probably goes into a little bit more detail on this exact case around Fred Singer, Fred Seitz, and Bill Nuremberg. These guys were not just scientists. I believe Fred Singer is a physicist, but they also were the public face of the doubt machine around tobacco, and then now on fossil fuels. And they're still at it today. And then if you look at the PR firms and think tanks, you have groups like the George C. Marshall Institute, Americans for Prosperity, Freedom Works. And it's not just a few connected politicians. A whole movement has roots with the tobacco industry and the fossil fuel industry. A highly cited study on this found that front groups with deep ties to the tobacco industry and the Koch brothers planned the inception of the Tea Party here in the US over a decade before it became a political and grassroots movement. Orchestrated by powers that have vested interest in obstructing government action. And if you really go deeper and deeper into what has motivated a lot of this, it seems to be based in ideology. It's not actually in science. It's more based in this holdover from what looks like the Cold War, of not wanting government to have too overbearing of an impact on businesses, which is just absurd when you're talking about two of the most deadly industries in the world. And so the list goes on and on from there, of the ties between the two. And to this day, you still have many consulting firms and legal experts who jumped in on the recent Exxon case in the U.S. after working very closely with the tobacco industry for many years.
Okay, so they're basically same people, the same ideas, and kind of the same background aim, which is not the government not to interfere too much in what they make profit of.
Mm-hmm,
so
exactly.
How do we make the fossil fuel industry pay for the damage that they have done?
Well, that is the question. I think there are a few ways right now that we're seeing the fossil fuel industry accountability movement take off. And the first is the divestment movement, or the divest invest movement, calling on big institutions, big investors to take their money out of fossil fuel industry and put it into, for example, clean energy. And that is having a big effect on the bottom lines of many of these corporations. When you talk about the endowments of some universities around the world, taking those endowments and those pension funds, investments out of big oil stocks, for example, can have a huge effect on their valuation in the long term. And so that helps do what we call shift the cost benefit ratio, and change their behavior as a result. But the larger movement to hold the industry accountable for the damage it has caused is right on track. If you look at the elements that I mentioned above around the tobacco industry, taking a village, organizers, advocates, journalists, governments, whistleblowers, it's hard not to see those pieces falling into place today around the fossil fuel industry. So we need not only continue, but escalate. Governments are inching toward the right actions, but it's not happening quickly enough. And the truth is the fossil fuel industry is even bigger, more powerful, and more versatile than big tobacco, or really any other industry in the world. So to win, we need to build a movement bigger than anything we've seen before. And everybody must know the industry's lies, deception, and the existential threat it poses to our world if we do not act. And so that is our role. That is the role of Corporate Accountability International. That is the role of journalism on climate change, is to make sure that people really understand what's at stake here and what needs to be done in order to win this fight.
Awesome, and I hope this motivates our trackers that are watching us to write about these issues. I know they are already, but it's very important, and especially when you hear about these things. Mm-hmm. So we know, when we've read about Article 19 of this Framework Convention for Tobacco Control, and it has been one of the main corners, especially when we talk about liability. So would you explain us a bit what is this article about, and why is it important?
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, just taking a step back on the FCTC, the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, I know most are familiar with it at this point, but its significance cannot be understated. It is the world's first public health and corporate accountability treaty, and so you see a lot of measures. You see measures like Article 19 in it that are not about reducing people's consumption, and I think this is key. It's about holding the industry accountable. So Article 19 encourages countries to hold the tobacco industry liable legally and financially, much like the US did in the 1990s through the Master Settlement Agreement that I mentioned a little bit earlier. So right now, we've worked with experts around the world to develop the tools and resources needed to make sure that every country has what they need. And this is like legislation, legal expertise, et cetera, to do the same and push the envelope even more. The US was a pioneer on this in the 1990s, but tobacco remains still to this day, the single largest cause of preventable death and disease in the world. So it's both a large threat, but a huge opportunity now. We know what can be done in this realm with the tobacco industry, and it's making sure that countries that are interested in doing so, that are ready to, for example, recoup the costs of healthcare related to tobacco. If they're ready to do that, Article 19 will give them the tools to do so. And just imagine if not one, but five, but 100 countries and took legal action against the tobacco industry. That more than anything else could change how the tobacco industry is able to operate today. 6 million people die every day from tobacco-related illness. But if we were able to start recouping those healthcare costs, that would also have a huge effect on their ability to expand, their ability to market, and their ability to interfere in policy processes that are meant to save lives. And so it's not just about legal action. It's not just about the money and what it can do for countries facing overwhelming healthcare costs, but it's also about what it will do to the industry's ability to expand its operations. So it's a really exciting opportunity. And parties are getting together in just about 2 weeks. On November 7th, the same starting day of COP22 in Marrakesh, is COP7 in New Delhi to strengthen this provision and move it forward.
Okay, so I see that you will have to pick which conference to go this time, and they are both really important. So I guess we agree that this article has to be more implemented and strengthened, right? Like there was this initial movement by the US, and they were pioneers on that, but that didn't happen so far in different countries.
Yeah, it does need to be strengthened. Much like the UNFCCC, the FCTC articles are not extremely long, you know, the actual convention itself. And this is an article within the convention of the FCTC. And so while it may be a very brief set of words, it's an incredibly complex issue. You're talking about legal frameworks within each country and how they're able to hold suit against multinational corporations. And so it does need strengthening, and that movement is underway right now. Because of its complexity, it is one of the treaty's least implemented articles, and the implementation is the same under this treaty as it is under, for example, the Paris Agreement. It's like taking that text and putting it into national law, putting it into national action. So we're changing that. We've worked with top experts around the world on industry liability to compile the tools and the guidance and the expertise so they're available in every country. And once they're well equipped with some ongoing support from experts, I think we'll see big progress in the coming years. There's a hunger for this to happen. Countries around the world are being taken advantage of and abused in large part by the tobacco industry. And this is costing millions of dollars, not to mention lives. And so there's a readiness amongst governments to finally get this bully out of the room and hold them financially liable for the abuses, for the lies, and for the health costs.
Awesome. Let's see if we can get them out of the room then. So the ones that we were involved know that something like this was raised there. So do you think there's a possibility of a similar case, complaint article, I don't know, will happen in the UNFCCC?
You know, it's hard to say what exactly will happen with the new UNFCCC. I will say that the heartening thing is that while the Paris Agreement, for example, contains no language around liability or compensation, that does not mean that countries aren't going on their own to do this. And that may largely be a function of the timing of these things. The development of the FCTC happened sort of in track with the legal liability cases going on in the US. And that's not the case with the UNFCCC. Its development is, the convention itself was developed over 2 decades ago. And these legal liability cases for the fossil fuel industry are happening now. So different in that sense, but a lot of the same tools do apply. And we're seeing that countries are taking a lot of the cues from the tobacco industry, from the movement to hold the tobacco industry liable, and applying them to the fossil fuel industry. I think the 2 cases that are the most important right now are looking at the Philippines Human Rights Commission case, 46 or 47 fossil fuel corporations, and the movement to hold Exxon accountable in the US for its lies on climate change. Those 2 cases could set a precedent for the rest of the world to follow suit and hold the fossil fuel industry liable for not only its climate deception for decades, but also the environmental impact of its products.
Sure, thanks. And I think the Filipino case and the other one against Exxon are really interesting. And I encourage everyone to write about them because it's really nice. I hope, I don't know what's the timeline for this, but I hope like it's ongoing and they are still being able to raise this issue against the fossil fuel industry. My last question for today would be about our trackers. So I know everyone will be asking now, how can they raise awareness of this issue? And we are writing articles about it, but maybe you want to explain a bit more, how can we put pressure into these industries?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And I think the key here is that we need to change how we're thinking about the industry. Across the board, I think for too long, the fossil fuel industry has gotten away with positioning itself as part of the solution on many different issues. And I think the more we dig, the more we find out about what it had planned, what it's been covering up, the more it becomes unconscionable that we continue to allow it to position itself as a stakeholder in the solution. They've been shaping the narrative and proposing solutions that help their bottom line, but don't save the planet. And so I think in general, what would be great to see the media world do is start treating the tobacco industry's input as what it is. It's not, in very few cases do you find that the fossil fuel industry, excuse me, I keep on swapping them. In very few cases do you find that the fossil fuel industry is doing what it says it wants to do. And I'll unpack that a little bit. There's a huge difference between what the industry's PR says it wants to do, for example, within the UNFCCC, and what it's actually doing in its business. And you can look no further than what we've learned about Exxon. While it was working with US legislators and others to fight the Kyoto Protocol, for example, and undermine climate science in the 90s, because it believed that its public-facing belief was that climate change wasn't real and it wasn't caused by humans. It was planning for climate change privately, building oil derricks that were, or oil platforms that were higher for increased sea level, and accommodating the very effects that it said were not happening. So we can no longer trust them as a stakeholder in media, and we can no longer trust them as a stakeholder in policy. And I think that's the sort of next part of this movement that we're coming on right now with the Exxon movement, with the Philippines case. It's understanding that there are not the two sides of this story that have been reported for so long are not real. There's the science, and then there's the non-science, and that's what the industry represents. And we've come a long way, but I think there's much more work to be done in making sure that people understand that there aren't two stories, there aren't two sides to this, and that if we continue to allow the industry to shape our narrative and shape our policy, we're not going to be able to stave off the worst effects of climate change. They are that important to the playbook that the tobacco industry pioneered in delaying policy changes that could save the planet.
I think the image of saying that climate change does not exist, but then raising your oil platforms for sea level rise is like the most powerful of this conversation today.
Yeah.
So I have one question now from Trinidad and Tobago, but I will encourage people, if they have, to send them while I'll ask this one. So people that are watching us, if you want to send some, that's the moment. So Dizan from Trinidad and Tobago asks, in my country, the oil and gas industry plays a big role in CSR and community development, of course. This economy is dependent on them, and how should journalists and NGOs approach this tricky situation? I think it's a bit what you were saying now, but maybe you want to answer her. Yeah.
It's a great question, and that is, unfortunately, almost the exact intent of that CSR, right? I mean, it creates a situation in which countries and people are conflicted. I want to take action. I want to hold this industry accountable, but they're funding this school, or they're helping with land restoration here. And I know if I do that, those programs could be cut. That's a difficult situation to be in, and I think seeing it for what it is the most important part. I would just use an analogy to help answer that question. If the tobacco industry were funding hospitals or paying for cancer treatment drugs for cancer patients, for example, we would no longer allow that to happen. But that wasn't in years past, that wasn't necessarily a frowned upon thing. And so I think as we shift, as public climate shifts, those types of programs will come into more and more scrutiny, the type of CSR that she's speaking of. But there's no easy answer there, because what you don't want to do is advocate that a certain program that the fossil fuel industry is funding, that may be helping people, is bad because the fossil fuel industry is funding it. But we need to find ways to move beyond relying on the fossil fuel industry, both from an economic point of view, but also from a CSR point of view. And media talking about the consequences of that, talking about how action has been delayed or could have been delayed because of that CSR, can go a long way in getting politicians to think more differently about it, and getting people to say, hey, do we really want to be beholden to this industry that is killing our planet because of the CSR? Or is there a different way we can go about this that doesn't allow the industry to continue to operate the way it does? So it's a hard question to answer, and it really depends on the realities in each country. But I think talking about those issues, making it clear that could be allowing or preventing strong policies from being put in place, can go a long way to changing how people think about it.
Awesome. Dizan is a great writer, so I'm sure she will find a way to put this dilemma into an article and just raise awareness about this. So I don't have any more questions from our audience right now.
Okay.
I have one myself, so maybe I can do this one, and then I let you continue your morning. So I remember that there's a section, a really small and vague one in the Paris Agreement, that says that somehow, someday, investments will shift and we will stop giving money as governments to the fossil fuel industry through subsidies and these things, and they will go to more sustainable things. And I'm sure the fossil fuel industry has been like scared and lobbying for these things. And that makes me think of the mechanisms of the tobacco industry, like, okay, we need like strong laws to protect people. We need strong laws to make these things happen. If not, they are too strong for governments to really take action. So I wanted to ask you how, because you're seeing some of these processes with the tobacco industry, you are trying to develop national policies on these things or liability cases. How does it look like? How can I have a general idea on how this will happen, if it ever happens with the fossil fuel industry?
It's a good question. It's on the subsidy front, just to put it into context, there's a report, I think 2 years ago, from Oil Change International that said the fossil fuel industry receives about $21 billion in public subsidies every year. I think first, just pausing on that number and thinking what we could do with that money if we put it into clean energy is staggering. But to get to your question about what, I just want to clarify, what you're wondering is what it could look like at the national level to hold the industry accountable.
Exactly, since it's legally something that you're working on with the with the tobacco industry.
I constantly say tobacco and I'm supposed to say fossil fuel industry. They're just so similar, I guess. Well, it really depends. So one of the reasons why as I understand, the case in the Philippines is because of the Human Rights Commission that the Philippines has. And so the key there is you need to have the legal in place in order to file a lawsuit like that. So that is a key, and that's what Article 19 starts to move forward on in the tobacco context, is helping countries create the laws that they need on the books in order to then take that next action to hold the industry liable. So that is the first step in any case, whether we're talking about tobacco or fossil fuels. What are the laws currently on the books that could allow this to happen? And if they don't exist, can we create them? And I think that is happening, or that is happening on tobacco now, and certainly is, if we're able to do it on tobacco, we may be potentially even able to use those same laws to hold the fossil fuel industry accountable later on. In the US, there was a combination of laws used in order to file those lawsuits. A lot of it centers around securities and exchange, and there was the SEC, as it's called in the US, the Securities Exchange Commission, just actually launched an investigation into Exxon. And those questions are a little bit different. What those questions are saying is Exxon, for example, has it been honest about the climate risk its business faces? And has it been honest with shareholders about that? So has it been underestimating how much climate change and potential regulation around climate change could cost its business and therefore shareholders? And so Exxon, for example, has been operating and telling shareholders that it's going to be able to extract and burn all the fossil fuels it knows it owns in the ground right now. Anyone who's working on climate change, part of the UNFCCC process, knows that if we're going to save this planet, that can't be true. And so somebody is lying here. And what the SEC investigation is looking at is, has Exxon been misleading its shareholders? It can continue to operate as business as usual. And what the science is telling us, and what the Paris Agreement is telling us, is that can't possibly continue. So that's another way that these industries liable is looking at the laws they have in the books to protect or to regulate businesses from a shareholder point of view. The other thing that was used in the US was a law that was put on the books around organized crime. It's called the RICO law, and forgive me, I'm just going to Google that acronym really quickly because I'm blanking on what exactly it stands for. The Racketeer, Influenced, and Corrupt Organizations Act. If you think about it, like old mafia movies, where you have a lot of organized crime in cities. That's what this law was made for, and then it was then applied to the tobacco industry and its collusion between corporations in order to mislead the public. So you have to find those laws, even if they weren't originally created, like this RICO piece, for what they're going to be used. Even though if they weren't created for the fossil fuel industry or for corporations, can they apply in this case? And legal experts are able to use things like the RICO law, and the SEC investigations are another route through which you can do that. And then the third one, as I mentioned before, is creating your own. What can you put on the books that will facilitate this type of a legal investigation?
That is super interesting. So basically, yeah, mafia and all this. I hope if we have trackers that are more legal experts than I do, can write articles that highlight these issues, because I think it's really great. So we have no more questions so far, and I think I have entertained you enough. But if you wanted to ask something else or to add anything, please feel free to do so. If not, we can close the webinar.
Okay. No, I think that I think we covered a lot, most of our bases here. I will just say that the really exciting thing is that the possibilities that the movements that we're now seeing to regulate the fossil fuel industry, hold them legally liable, and the progress we've made on that same front with tobacco are really coming together at this point, where both of these conference and parties are happening at the same time, and both bodies are discussing some of the very same issues. And so once again, just like how the tobacco industry wrote this playbook, the movement to regulate the tobacco industry is writing that playbook. And so to the extent that lawmakers and activists and journalists can look to the tobacco industry and this movement to regulate it, and see how that applies to the fossil fuel industry, there's a lot of promise there. And we're in a really exciting crossroads now with the Exxon campaign in the US. Multiple states attorney general are investigating Exxon for its lies and abuses. You have the case in the Philippines, and much more opportunity to expand. So I think with the work that the trackers are doing, and in covering this and talking about these, hopefully as two sort of ships moving in the same direction, we can help shift some of that public climate to expand the opportunity we have in front of us to hold the fossil fuel industry accountable for its deception and environmental destruction.
So we are copying the playbook, but in the good sense this time.
Yep.
So we are taking the laws and the strategies from the tobacco activists, which is great.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so thank you, Jesse. I think there's no more questions, but I'm sure this has been really useful. At least I really enjoyed the webinar, and looking forward reading all those articles and discussing them, of course. Thanks for your time, and thanks everyone who was watching us. It was really nice.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Take care. Goodbye.